Hello, everybody.
Hi. After I left the witnesses, I felt a little like Ebenezer Scrooge on Christmas morning. I don't know if you've gotten over your not watching Christmas movies, but it's one of our favorites. And at Christmas morning, Ebenezer Scrooge he sings this little jingle that kind of sums up the way I felt. Now, I'm shy to sing, so we're going to let David sing the song for me. It starts, I don't know anything.
I never did know anything. Now I know that I don't know all of a Christmas morning.
So I felt like Ebenezer Scrooge, except without that joy that he had. Because I realized I didn't know anything. I was very paranoid, so I didn't trust people, and I wouldn't read books. I was starting from scratch.
I think that's true of most of us during that generation. We were kind of like, and proud to be like Sam Cooke and Herman's Hermits. Don't know much about history, don't know much trigonometry, but now I know. Ebenezer says what I don't know.
When I was in school, I paid very little attention, and history certainly wasn't a subject I was interested in. I think it's only since leaving the witnesses, and I would never in a million years have thought I'd be interested in reading whole books on history.
Well, we owe a lot of that, of course, to the propaganda of the Watchtower. There's really no relevant history before Charles Russell comes along. All of it that you do know about. And I did know something because I was given a high school education the decade before you were, and we did study English history, and we did study Canadian and American history to some extent, but it was a general impression of progress over the previous 200-300 years, but without too many specifics about the motivation of the individuals, and that's the difference that later our studies made to us.
Yeah, I think a lot of the more modern renditions of history improve somewhat because they draw you into the individual persons involved in the historical events. Because if you don't get that, it's just dates, names. I mean, that's what it meant to me when I was a kid. Dates and names, very dry. This happened this year.
The why is usually missing, though. For me, it was in high school. It was obvious why things had to change, but who are the movers and shakers? That was all more or less missing. And even the names I knew, there was a lot of names I didn't know, and this is where this book comes in. This Freedom Whence, John Wesley Bready, by the way, a Canadian minister who has earned degrees in 4 different universities. And when he wrote this book in the late 1930s, he felt that the education system was failing already to remind people of where our Western freedoms had come from. And in the wake of the growing threat of Nazism and other fascist and communist movements, he felt we had to wake up to where our heritage indeed was rooted. And so I thought, I didn't see this at the time, but John Stott had already written a book mentioning Brady's book admiringly back in 1984. In this book, Decisive Issues Facing Christians Today, Stott had mentioned the basic scenario that Bready puts before us all here, namely that the changes, the progress of the Western world weren't automatic. They didn't just evolve. There were people that were used by God, famous Christians. They were famous when they did these things, but have been forgotten by history. Their names are more or less neglected now, and therefore the urgency that Bready felt in the late 1930s is far more relevant today. That's why on page 2 of this book, John Stott details some of the influence of John Wesley and his disciples, the people who were inspired by John Wesley, upon the next 100 years.
Okay. The subtitle is The Evangelical Heritage of Social Concern. There are some remarkable examples of this in 18th century Europe and America. The evangelical revival, which stirred both continents, is not to be thought of only in terms of preaching of the gospel and converting of sinners to Christ. It also led to widespread philanthropy and profoundly affected society on both sides of the Atlantic. John Wesley remains the most striking instance. He is probably remembered as the itinerant evangelist and open-air preacher, and so he was. But the gospel he preached inspired people to take up social causes in the name of Christ. Historians have attributed to Wesley's influence, rather than to any other, the fact that Britain was spared the horrors of a bloody revolution, like France's. The change which came over Britain during this period was well documented in J. Wesley Brady's remarkable book, England Before and After Wesley, subtitled The Evangelical Revival and Social Reform. His research forced him to conclude that the true nursing mother of the spirit and character values that have created and sustained free institutions throughout the English-speaking world, indeed the moral watershed of Anglo-Saxon history, was the much neglected and oft lampooned evangelical revival.
Stott goes on, Brady described the deep savagery, this is a direct quote from Brady, the deep savagery of much of the 18th century, which was characterized by the wanton torture of animals for sport, the bestial drunkenness of the populace, the inhuman traffic in African Negroes, the kidnapping of fellow countrymen for exportation and sale as slaves, the mortality of parish children, the universal gambling obsession, the savagery of the prison system and penal code, the welter of immorality, the prostitution of the theater, the growing prevalence of lawlessness, superstition and lewdness, the political bribery and corruption, the ecclesiastical arrogance and truculence, the shallow pretensions of deism, the insincerity and debasement rampant in church and state. Such manifestations suggest that the British people were then perhaps as deeply degraded and debauched as any people in Christendom. The end of Brady's quote. But then Stott says, but then things began to change. And in the 19th century, slavery and the slave trade were abolished, the prison system was humanized, conditions in factory and mine were improved, education became available to the poor, trades unions began, etc., etc. Well, there's a lot of etceteras that are dealt with in this book. And he says, whence then came this pronounced humanity, this passion for social justice and sensitivity to human wrongs? There is but one answer commensurate with stubborn historical truth. It derived from a new social conscience, which is linked to the things detailed in the very book that Stott is quoting here, called in England, England Before and After Wesley, but in North America, when it was published in 1942, in a revised form, it was called This Freedom Whence. So Brady felt it was very necessary that we in the West be reminded that we can't take our freedoms for granted. And if this message is pertinent in 1938 and 1942, all the more so in 2020. So what Brady does here is give names, put faces and names to the changes. Who were used by God to bring about these great changes? In addition to John Wesley, the great revivalist himself, his brother Charles, who wrote many of the most famous hymns of the church, also a fruit of that revival. And then John Newton, who was himself a slave trader and became a great preacher and a minister of the Church of England. And he inspired William Wilberforce, who then became the greatest name in the abolition of the slave trade, and then, of course, the end of slavery itself in 1833.
You've got John Howard, who was involved in prison reform, and you've got Lord Shaftesbury, who really changed a lot of the problems that faced families, so and children in the streets that had nowhere to go. And
again, if you know anything of Dickens, you might not be able to put a finger on the date, but the Dickens novels are all generated by that period of great reform, the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. Those novels were written. So if you've seen any of the movies
Twist,
made of Dickens, the Oliver Twist or
Christmas Carol, yeah.
All of them really have the backdrop of the plight of the poor in those days. And so just as Dickens awakened the conscience of England through literature, you could say Lord Shaftesbury was doing that very thing in Parliament. And ending the chimney sweeps, for instance, those little boys who were forced to go up chimneys
who usually
day after day.
were street urchins, right? They didn't have a home.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of kids just abandoned and left to run the streets with
Again,
nowhere to go.
I'm reminded of another line from A Christmas Carol the day before his change, when he said in response to a request for alms,
Yeah. Are there no
prisons?
Are there no workhouses?
This is the best England can do? Well, no, it wasn't. So Shaftesbury awoke England to the necessity of changing the industrial landscape so that mothers didn't have to have their children standing by them
Well, yeah,
all
because
day long, 16-hour
no
days.
public school.
No public
And no
schools.
Sunday school. So all these things did have impact on society. I mean, Sunday schools were started to get kids off the streets. That was the motivation. That was
and then
Raikes, right?
Robert Raikes.
And
then public education was begun during that very same period. And after Shaftesbury came along Thomas Barnardo and the homes for waifs. And then after that, the booths, the foundation of the Salvation Army. So there's been and this takes us right up to the days of Russell. So God was doing something through all these individuals. They're not the only ones, the ones we've named. They were just the most prominent believers.
Yeah. And I think with the booths, they were very instrumental in lifting the lower classes out of this dependency on alcohol.
Yeah.
To cover over their problems, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But they were all just soaked. These people were soaked in alcohol.
Especially in the period where the Wesleys came to the first generation, about 1840, 1850, the evangelical revival. England was sodden. The lower classes particularly were reduced to permanent penury and short lives. Especially because of the influence of alcohol. So it wasn't so much that there was law that brought about the changing the laws, although there was some of that too. But it was the transformation of the people.
Yeah, motivation. They weren't just demanded to stop. They were given the motivation.
So when I was in school, I didn't hear about that. I didn't hear that the people themselves were transformed by the preaching of the gospel and the taking seriously of discipleship, which is where the word Methodism comes from. That there was a method to what John Wesley was doing that would raise up men from their condition and transform them through discipleship. So all of this is detailed in Brady's book.
So we should place Russell though in our conversation here. So I mean, he's reaping the benefits basically of what other people have done.
Yeah, the reforms all around us in the late Victorian era. So Shaftesbury, Barnardo, and the Booths, the foundation of the Salvation Army, are all alive when Russell is a youngish man. So do we talk about that if we're Jehovah's Witnesses? Not at all.
I don't think you know it. I didn't know it. When I was a witness, I knew very little about history. And it's always very fuzzy, and the Watchtower shields you from those histories. So we've mentioned in other videos, we looked up certain people in the index to see what the Watchtower had to say about them. Some people aren't mentioned at all.
Yeah.
Wilberforce isn't mentioned.
Not mentioned once. So we've made a video about that. We'll link that. But again, a plug for this book. John Wesley Bready, This Freedom Whence, also known as England Before and After Wesley.
So we'll be reading.
Every Christian and every non-Christian should read this book. It changed us and changed several of our friends too when they read it and saw what evangelical Christianity had done for them and all of us in the Western world. This Freedom Whence. So I'll put the link to the videos we did on Jonathan Edwards and he that is not mentioned at all in the Watchtower Index, William Wilberforce.